we are just so happy to have you here at ARCE tonight, and thank you for being here. So, about our esteemed speaker. Since 1993, Stephen Harvey has been director of the ARCE-NY project, which centers on excavation of the pyramidal complex of King Ahmose at Abydos, southern Egypt. He received his PhD in Egyptian archaeology in 1998 when he was 3 years old from the University of Pennsylvania, and his BA in archaeological studies from Yale in 1987. Harvey's fieldwork in and around the pyramid complex of Ahmose has resulted in major discoveries, some of which you'll be hearing about tonight, including several previously undiscovered temples, the identification of the pyramid of Queen Tetisheri, and the analysis of thousands of fragments of the temple's decorative program. In addition to extensive fieldwork at Abydos, Harvey has worked in Egypt at Giza and Memphis, as well as on archaeological projects in the United States, Syria, and Turkey. And there's more. Shall I stop there?
I think you can stop.
I'm going to stop right there, because you don't want to hear me, you want to hear Stephen Harvey.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and thank you all. Well, what I'm talking about tonight, as you can see, is something that's of great interest to me in recent years. And the reason is that 30 years ago, working at Abydos in southern Egypt, and I'll show you that map in a moment, I found what are still, 30 years later, the earliest scenes of a horse and chariot battle warfare in Egypt. And they entered into the literature, and it's a very exciting set of material. It's very fragmentary. So those of you who aren't Egyptologists will have to use a little imagination tonight, but I know from many of you that that's no problem with folks who have come out. So I'm going to start with the first slide. What are our sources on early horses and chariots, and why should we care? Well, you know, the important thing to tell you first is that horses and chariots were not present in North Africa from the beginning. That is to say, when Egypt's pyramidal society begins, you know, famously around 3100 BCE, horses weren't on the landscape. They were donkeys, and donkeys were at sometimes an elite and sometimes a not elite mode of transportation, but there were no wheeled vehicles. And it's only with the coming of occupiers who came into Egypt, Canaanites, over the Sinai land bridge, who then took control of Egypt eventually as a great dynasty we call the Hyksos dynasty about 1650 BCE, after the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, these great ages, that the horse was introduced, and with it the chariot. And that transformed warfare for reasons we'll talk more about. So what do we have as evidence from the beginnings of this really transformational and important development? We have representations of horses and chariots, and that's my theme tonight. We have textual mentions in hieroglyphs of horses and chariots, sometimes showing these beasts, and sometimes just the word that means team of horses. We have the actual remains, actually, of chariots, famously from Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, found in 1922, but lots of other besides, wood and leather, and the actual harnessing in some cases. We have faunal remains of horses and other equids, but these are very rare. So surprisingly, even though the pharaohs were using horses and marshaling them in battle against enemies, as far north as modern-day Turkey and Syria, trying to fight the Hittites, and down in Sudan, where the Sudanese population, the Nubians, become great lovers of horses as well, we just don't have very many actual skeletons for various reasons. We then have indirect evidence, and I'll be talking about some of this tonight. Human remains showing possible evidence of horse riding, which is almost never depicted in Egyptian art. We have depictions, mentions, or examples of different items that can be construed to relate to chariots, such as riding gloves. For example, King Tut had gloves in his tomb, beautiful gloves that are going to be on display in the Grand Egyptian Museum when it finally opens, and no one knows when that is, but that seem to be from riding and holding the leather harnesses, the reins, pardon me, of chariot horses. But that's indirect. So what do we have as evidence? Well, I mentioned to you the second intermediate period, that's what academics call it, of rule, the 1650 to 1550 BC.
Wow.
When the traditional Egyptian indigenous rulers who had controlled all the way up to the Mediterranean, the delta region of Egypt, and beyond to the sea, were pushed south to southern Egypt, the area of modern Luxor, ancient Thebes, and no longer controlled the north. And instead, the Canaanite rulers, whose leaders were called Hyksos, or rulers of a foreign land, ruled northern Egypt for a century. And horses and chariots seem to appear at this point. But what I want to tell you is that we know next to nothing about this manner of introduction. How did horses come in? Who brought them in? We assume they came in with these people of foreign origin because horse and chariot technology has a long history going back thousands of years into the steppes of Russia, and gradually from the Caucasus comes down to the Near East, Western Asia, and then eventually into Egypt at about 1650. But we don't know the story, right? Did the Egyptians steal this technology from the Canaanites ruling in the north, and some spies went north and took horses and learned horse breeding and how to construct these chariots and then use these weapons against their foe in the north, and then use that technology to build an empire, as they do? Or did they come some other way? But what we know is that the woods used, and this is an important thing, are not Egyptian riverine woods. They're ash wood, cherry wood, even birch bark. So the actual wood of these wonderful, lightweight, flexible machines attached to horses, which are exotic and need to be bred and trained in very specific ways to work together as chariots, that is exotic. And the terms used are mainly borrowed from Semitic languages. That is to say, not from the Egyptian language, so they'll take not just the technology, but the words that go with them. The same way that, I always use this example, but if you're eating sushi, you don't call it generally by the English fish name, right? You say uni and ikura and maguro because that's the words that pertain to it. In the same way with chariotry, horse breeding, all of it had a whole vocabulary that was imported. The first mention of chariots, and I'll show you more attractive images in a second, occur on what we call the Kamoza stela, Ahmose's predecessor, the pharaoh whose site I've been digging for 30 years and been focusing on research of, about 1555 BC. Ahmose comes along after Kamoza disappears, dies probably in battle, and Ahmose defeats the Hyksos in a final way, reunifies Egypt, and with it opens up the new kingdom, the Golden Age, 18th dynasty, famous for King Tut, for Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, the heretic king Akhenaten, these great rulers who then build empire into Sudan and up into Asia. So the earliest evidence that I'm going to be discussing I found in 1993 at Abydos. So this is that slab called the Kamoza stela, found in the 1950s in Karnak Temple, and it has no pictures on it of any of the activities it describes. It's purely hieroglyphic writing, which uses pictures for the representation of language, but does not form a narrative in visual sense. It's a literary narrative, and on it we get wonderful descriptions of the battles that Kamoza waged against the Hyksos king at the city of Avaris. And Avaris was the capital in the eastern delta of Egypt, up close to the Mediterranean and with access points to the Sinai and thence to Canaan, Gaza, the area, of course, that's much in the news right now. So what's powerful about this text is it gives us notice that the Egyptians were, under Kamoza, sailing north in great royal battleships, that they were using chariotry against the enemy, and literally going up to the city walls and shaking their fists at the king Apophis, the Hyksos king, saying they're cutting down the wine of the vineyards and probably cutting off the food supply too in a siege, and that's the last we hear of Kamoza. So it sounds like he's about to defeat the Hyksos and win back the north, but that's all we get from this monument. That monument is from Thebes, modern-day Luxor, where Karnak is located, But and I mentioned to you the eastern delta of ARCE, up on the eastern branch, the Pelusiac branch of the Nile here. You see the Sinai land bridge to southern Palestine and Israel. Memphis is modern-day Cairo, the age-old capital. And I want to remind you that when we're talking about an era when the Egyptians are based at Thebes and pushed to the south, they have no access to the Mediterranean Sea. They can't get to shipping lanes for bringing things like cedars of Lebanon and other exotic goods. They can't go to the traditional pyramids and temples of their ancestors. They can't go to the palaces of their predecessors. This is all cut off to them and controlled by the Canaanites, by the Hyksos, or the people of Canaanite origin. We should say, probably better to call them Canaanite Egyptians, just the way we would say Asian Americans. People who had acculturated, became bicultural, and lived in northern Egypt, but were of foreign origin. Abydos, I didn't show you clearly enough, is located above the bend in the Nile here, and Abydos is a site that if some of you have been to Egypt, many of you have, I know, you will know it for the temples of Seti I and his son Ramses the Great. Beautiful temples with incredible carvings in original colors as shown here, well preserved, where the god Osiris, the god primarily responsible for rebirth and resurrection in Egyptian thinking, was venerated alongside Isis, his sister and wife, at this place, which was particularly sacred for 3,000 years and beyond. But at Abydos was also located something that we didn't know about until 1899. British archaeologists, under the great William Matthew Flinders Petrie, went to explore a mound of sand. And what you're seeing here is actually a satellite image that a colleague of mine, Brian Kramer, has stretched and added some of our architectural musings onto based on excavation. So we see here a perhaps unfinished pyramid of Ahmosa, which is the last royal pyramid built in Egypt, as far as we know. But not just one pyramid was built here. A second one was built by Ahmosa for his grandmother. Not her actual tomb, as we learned from an inscription found within it, but a memorial pyramid, and I was able to demonstrate in recent years, in 2004, that it is indeed a pyramid, and it's recently been partially restored by the Egyptians, with an enclosure wall around it located half a kilometer away in the desert. So at Abydos there's a very important thing to see, which is the floodplain, the green area of cultivation, the low desert which leads up to the high cliffs, and these high cliffs are kind of the boundary of the site. And against the high cliffs, Ahmosa also built a terrace structure that we've imagined some sort of ramp up to. That's completely imaginary. I may be wrong, but the idea is that this is a kilometer of monuments out against the desert. And I want to tell you something important, which is that Ahmosa, his body has never been found. Well, pardon me, let me restate that. His tomb has never been found or identified in a clear way. His body was located at Thebes and found reburied in 1881 in a cache of collected mummies, royal mummies, that are now on display in Cairo. And it's interesting because there's no tomb ever identified for Ahmosa at Thebes. And no ancient texts mention a tomb of Ahmosa at Thebes. And Ahmosa doesn't have a temple of any type at Thebes that we could call a mortuary temple of the king. Although that's normally the practice. You have a tomb, you have a temple. So where was Ahmosa buried? Well, the fact that there's a body, a mummy, reburied at Luxor makes everyone say, must have been buried at Luxor. But I don't think so. I think that this kilometer of monuments, which includes not just the pyramid of Ahmosa, but perhaps even a queen's small pyramid at its base, that's a conjecture on my part. It's very destroyed, so it's hard to say. But what we have at the base, as was discovered in about 1899, 1900, is a pyramid temple, and that's going to be the main focus of what I talk about. And then in subsequent years, the 90s into 2000s, I found several more temples built by Ahmose Nefertari, his wife and sister. Egyptians have this sister-wife marriage that's against our moral code, but was not against theirs for royal people and for deities. Now, in very recent years, my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Joe Wegner, who's the professor there of Egyptology, discovered something amazing. And this is relevant to our story because he found that in the desert over here, next to the monuments of a Middle Kingdom pharaoh called Senwosret III, his massive underground tomb that I'm not going to talk about tonight is located in this area. But next to it, a rather tiny tomb was found, which contained a stone burial chamber with paintings and cartouches. And cartouches are the name rings, the rings that show that a pharaoh's name is within. And even a beginning student of hieroglyphs can read this name, Seneb-Kai. And as Joe found this burial of a king and looked at those hieroglyphs, he had one question. Who the heck is Seneb-Kai? Because he'd never heard of him. And none of us, in fact, ever had. He's not listed in any king list. He's not listed by any ancient sources or any later sources. And there's almost no evidence that he ever existed except this tomb. And more wonderful than just finding this tomb and saying, well, gosh, here's an interesting ruler who lived after the Middle Kingdom, probably in this era we call the Second Intermediate Period, 1650 to 1525 BC, was his body. Now, this is extraordinary, because usually if you dig a tomb in Egypt, it's true that King Tut's tomb was intact and his body was found there, the boy king, about 18 years old when he died. But to find a new tomb of a new pharaoh representing a new dynasty, that is to say, a new family of pharaohs we didn't even really know about, was extraordinary. And the body had something else interesting about it. The body shows, from its studies by scholars Jane Hill and Maria Rosado, that Seneb-Kai was probably killed in battle. And I'll show you his head in a moment. I'm sorry if that's offensive to anyone to see skeleton or human remains, but it's vital to the talk tonight. But interestingly, the scholars who studied the human remains noted severely interesting evidence that the legs are perhaps bandy-legged because he was a horseman. Or, you know, one might say, couldn't he have ridden donkeys? And I do have a little question there. I'm not a physical anthropologist, someone who studies bodies in this way, but I wonder if we can really firmly say he rode horses when this is 100 years before we even have evidence of horses in any regard, in any inscription, in any form. But if we can take this as indirect evidence, it is very interesting that this Abydos king, and he's only a local king, and this is an important point. Seneb-Kai belongs to what has now been dubbed, since the 1990s, the Abydos dynasty. Why? Because we don't have a number. We have 31 dynasties of pharaohs from 3100 BC to 30 BC. 3,000 years, numbered sequentially according to tradition. This guy doesn't belong to a numbered group. Because why? He is a local kinglet, maybe a minor guy, essentially like a mayor or something, who calls himself a pharaoh. You know, he's an upstart. And in that regard, it's very interesting that he died in battle and perhaps had a military background himself. And we'll come back to that. Now, prior to that discovery, I want to go back to what I had worked on. The Amosa Pyramid Temple and its environs was an extraordinary site to work on, and still is potentially. It's because when we started digging there, you know, there had been an excavation by the British in 1900, as I said, and they published 2 pages and a couple of photos, but we started digging in the earth, and we realized there were still, at first, hundreds and then thousands of tiny pulverized fragments of things like statues. So you see a pillar of a statue here, a back pillar. This is a pillar from the actual temple itself with inscriptions on it, part of the hand of a statue. We see all this evidence, and it was just representing a completely destroyed monument. And at first that was interesting, and I was glad to see it. It was going to be my PhD. It was, in fact, my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. But one day in February 1993, 30 years ago, I found this piece. My colleague Joe Wegner, the same one who found Seneb-Kai, had just dug it up, or his workmen had dug it up. We employ Egyptian local workers to get the work going faster. We work on a bigger scale. It was sitting in a basket, and I picked it up. It's only this big. It's just about under a foot high. And I was astonished, because it wasn't the kind of religious scenes we've been seeing up to that point. It was a scene of battle. Now, I've told you, Ahmose is the king who defeated the Hyksos. He's the king who reunified Egypt, kicked out foreigners, and reconsolidated Egypt beyond just Egyptian borders up to the Mediterranean, but into southern Palestine and down into Nubia. These archers are fascinating because they're overlapped in a tight formation. 3 archers we see here with their arrows pointed up in the air. And this meant something to me rather instantly because we know about these kind of scenes from other Egyptian sources. I hope I'll have included those in my lecture later on. Battle scenes are not common, and they're not attested at all in this early period, or at least they weren't 30 years ago. So next slide. The other thing we started seeing out of the area that we were working in were other scenes of battle. So here, the arm of an individual, and he's holding a sword, and that arm is distinctive because he has a fringed garment, kind of looks like a buckskin jacket if you think of the American West, something like that. But it's a typical garment, as I'll show you in other slides, of Canaanites. So this is a Canaanite or Asiatic enemy, someone from the northeast, perhaps the Hyksos, we could really say. And what we're seeing in this fragment is a little bit hard to tell, but I'll show you a reconstruction in a minute to make it a little clearer. We had also the heads of these foreigners. Egyptians did not, generally speaking, show themselves with full beards. Kings and gods had braided beards sometimes, or frequently. But this kind of full beard with this kind of kerchief is something unknown in Egyptian representation, but extremely well known from Canaanite representation. Western Asiatics, people of modern day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, southern Palestine. And this man was very intriguing because it relates to what I've seen, the battle scenes, because he's probably dead. It's a slit eye, and the Egyptians show enemies on the battlefield who've been killed. The point of Egyptian battle scenes is not to show a fair fight. It's to show the domination of the pharaoh over foreign elements. And in that regard, it's really about royal power and Egyptian dominance, not especially PC today. What was interesting when I found these is I was told prior to going to Egypt, and I was told by my colleagues that these should not exist. And the reason they shouldn't have existed was very clearly stated by scholars in different sources. So in the 1950s, the very important scholar of art history, Groeneweg in Frankfurt, wrote a book called Arrest and Movement, problematic book where she tries to talk about the history of Egyptian art and Near Eastern art, in particular battle scenes, narrative scenes. And she said only in the relief of the successor of Tutankhamun, Horemheb, so this is about 1300 BC, do we see rather timid traces of real battle. So it's almost as if like, well, you know, after King Tut they can start to do a little bit of battle, but as far as we know for the first time, early New Kingdom art was in the main conservative, royal reliefs probably more so. We therefore need not postulate more adventurousness than the available material, however scanty, reveals. So in other words, we can just assume that the Egyptians didn't do battle scenes until the end of the 18th dynasty, 1350 BC, King Tut's tomb, right? We have decorations and images that show battles and so on. But after that, most famously, we have battle scenes in the time of the Ramses kings, about 1250 BC. So then, an Egyptian scholar, Ali Gabala, wrote in 1976 a book on narrative in Egyptian art, and it's very interesting. He says, is the absence of war scenes due to coincidence, since we don't have reliefs from any of the funerary temples of the warrior kings, like Moses? He says, in my belief, it's not the case. It's not a coincidence. It's because at the height of the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, earlier scenes, earlier periods, no war scenes were included in temple reliefs, so we shouldn't expect them in later times, apart from the king bashing in the head of enemies. But, you know, this is what he's saying. So we were, based on the absence of information, right, and this is a bad scientific protocol, as we know, right, based on the absence of information, negative evidence, we're saying they could not exist. And even further, this is a translation I did from the German on the left in the 1920s, you know, it attests to the deficient historical sense of the Egyptian people. They weren't good at history by nature, right? This is kind of racist. Apart from a few reports of a personal sword in two tombs of fellow combatants, the tomb of Ahmose, son of Aban at Al-Kab. They're referring to. No reference has been found in the literature or the inscriptions of the period to this truly significant act, the defeat of the Hyksos, which one can place in importance, and I agree with this, alongside the freeing of Greece from the Persians. This was a monumental task to retrieve Egypt from the control of foreign elements that would have propelled Egypt, basically would have fast-forwarded 1,000 years to the Third Intermediate Period, to the end of Egyptian indigenous control, essentially. But they were able to pull that back. But it's interesting that the deficient historical sense is what's being told to be responsible. So what do we have? And what did we have, even long ago, for evidence for battle scenes in the early 18th dynasty? Well, we didn't have the chariot battle scenes until I found them, but we did have things like this incredible gold battle axe. This is solid gold with gold lashings. These lashings up here should have been rawhide if it were a real axe used in daily warfare. But this is a royal object found in a royal burial context. The burial of a woman called Ahotep, who may be the mother of Ahmose, and it bears the name of Nefertire Ahmose. This is Ahmose who defeated the Hyksos, and here he's shown dispatching, killing some enemy. We don't get the ethnic characterization here. It's not clear. Could be a northern Egyptian, it could be a foreigner, but what we get at the bottom here is nothing short of extraordinary. It's a Mycenaean griffin. So, a Greek contemporary imaginary animal. And if that weren't amazing enough, borrowed from the art of the Greek world in 1550 BC, 1525 BC, above it in hieroglyphs it tells us how the Egyptians viewed this animal. It's an animal beloved of Montu, the god of war, a falcon god, and it's interesting that it has this bird head. So this animal was seen to be relating somehow to Montu, the war god, and is placed on a war ceremonial axe or parade axe, one could think of it as, with a scene of warfare. So, is there an inherent inability to represent war? No. There's quite a good ability, and to do it within an international context that pulls in, and think about this in terms of the horse and the chariot, elements that are brought in from far away, that are reinterpreted for use against the enemy themselves, right? So the horse and the chariot are foreign elements with foreign words describing them, used against the enemy themselves. It very much fits in with Egyptian magic and how the Egyptians used an element of the enemy in order to fight the enemy. And we see that with this kind of iconography too. Globalism, internationalism, because they wanted to reclaim empire, perhaps. Now, interestingly, and one of the reasons for wanting to do a talk about this is that over the 30 years I've been working and thinking about this, there are more images available that show that Ahmose was very richly involved in representation of battle. This is from a private collection in Germany, in Hamburg. Has been displayed in the Reichs-Engelhorn Museum recently, and it gives the cartouche of Ahmose. It's certainly authentic, there's no question there. He's got a mace, the traditional thing they use to smash in the heads of enemies. He is killing, dispatching 2 enemies and trampling on one. And this is narrative art in the really beautiful sense. On a tiny scarab, only this high, sort of fingernail-sized, carved by a master carver. And you see here the sign for life that is anthropomorphized, turned into a human type thing, holding a fan, and that is an emblem of divinity. So it's divinely sanctioned defeat of enemies here. We see also, and this was not published to my knowledge until recently, something far more exciting when we're talking about horses and chariots, which is on a scarab in the British Museum. And again, many of these things are from the art market. We didn't really know much about them until recently. Horse and chariot team, 2 horses attached to a chariot with 4 spokes, the early style, and the pharaoh firing arrows at an enemy. And again, the enemy's wearing a little kilt. We don't get much ethnic designation here, but perhaps a Canaanite based on the long type of staff, but we can't say. And this is Pharaoh Thutmose I, so 2 kings after Ahmose and his grandson. And very interesting representation it is, because this is what we're going to see amplified in more cases. And then also recently published by a scholar associated with the Brooklyn Museum for decades, Bob Bianchi, a carnelian plaque in London showing something lovely, which is a pharaoh who was famous for sports activities and warfare. Amenhotep II, also in this early part of the 18th dynasty, feeding a horse by hand. So he was known to love horses, and we have some evidence about that in texts. And here, combating an animal, which sort of stands in for a foreign animal, a foreign person. And in the same time of Amenhotep II, from Karnak, we have not so well known scenes of battle. So the pharaoh using a curved sword, also imported from Asia. Again, a foreign type object that becomes the very symbol for fighting the enemies. That's imported and used to defeat enemies. We see Canaanites with their long beards here. We see the god Amun giving the pharaoh the right to conduct warfare. And then we see something important here, the horses and the chariots. And very strange image here of foreigners who are tied with their arms behind their backs as prisoners and being ridden on the pharaoh's chariot, some perhaps even within the chariot, tied up. It's brutal, it's austere, it's not pleasant, but this is the Egyptian scene of power. Most splendidly, and this is a drawing by the famous archaeologist Howard Carter, who found Tutankhamun's tomb. In the early 20th century was found an actual chariot body of a pharaoh, Thutmose IV, who's shown here in on this chariot. So this is the side of an actual chariot, representing, it's very meta, representing a chariot being driven with two royal horses. And what's happening on the battlefield is that these Canaanites are being shot dead, and the horses are being shot dead. So we see chaos. We see upended horses, turned upside down chariots, dead and dying, foreigners, some with their hands cut off. It's brutal, but they have foreign swords, much like in the fragments I've talked to you about. And this is Thutmose IV, who is the predecessor of Amenhotep III, greater, later 18th dynasty ruler. And this, although it's not on the walls of a temple, tells us once again that they could, in this time, create, and did create clearly, very rich decorated scenes that are extraordinary. And I love the inscription because it talks about the fact that the pharaoh is like the goddess Astarte upon her horses. So Astarte, Ishtar, is a foreign goddess, and once again they're using the foreign deities to introduce the element of foreignness and then magically employ that against the people who were indigenously the worshippers of those gods. And wonderfully, I mentioned the god Mantu, the god of war. There he is, much like Krishna guiding the charioteer Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, where you have the two figures together in the chariot, and that's the whole theme of that wonderful song and story. Here too, Mantu literally guides the arm of the pharaoh, so he will shoot straight. And it's a wonderful scene of how divinity is not just evoked by the Ankh, the sign for life with the fan that means that divinity is present, the shadow of divinity, but the pharaoh is literally being trained, even taught and held up with his reins tied around his waist. This is a wonderful thing, right? And this has been tested. A TV show I did for Nova was involved with for Nova called Building Pharaoh's Chariots. We were involved in building a chariot, training the horses, and then a guy called Mike Lodes, who does this kind of stuff, rode the horses out in the desert, tied the reins around his waist, and was able to fire quite accurately at targets. So this can be done. It's often said that this is a fantasy kind of image, but in fact could perhaps be done by a very proficient rider. So a wonderful, wonderful scene. And this is the other side of the chariot where we don't see the god, we see the shadow, the divine shadow of the fan. And we see the pharaoh grasping two enemies in their chariots, probably two high levels, generals, let's say, or maybe chiefs who are being personally axed to death by the pharaoh. So scenes of mayhem and destruction, but that give us a very rich idea for what these narratives look like. You see the enemy looking back in horror as they flee, they're running away. And at the Metropolitan Museum, and you can go see this here in the city, two blocks, monumental, very large-scale blocks, were always assumed to be from the Ramses time because we were told they can't be any earlier. And yet, in 1994, I believe it was, a colleague of mine in Memphis, Tennessee now, Peter Brand, said, no, these have to be earlier because the style is earlier. This is something from the time of the Thutmoses kings or Amenhotep II. So this same time period, the middle part of the dynasty, which shows that monumental temples had beautifully colored scenes of horses. You see the bellies of the horse, the stallion's genitals here, and then two forelegs, so two horses here. And these are dead and dying enemies with their long swords, their fringed garment. If you remember the buckskin style garments, these long galabia type or jalaba garments these men are wearing, their long beards, and so on. So this is enemies being defeated by the pharaoh, no doubt, at a massive temple located in western Thebes, the area near Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri. Why does that matter? Because we now can say, one, there were early scenes. Two, they were probably in every temple of the entire 18th dynasty. We just don't have them. And then they're also monumental, in many cases, brightly colored, and it's only these small objects that imitate and copy what was seen in these larger temples. And the same is true for Tutankhamun. The scholar Ray Johnson has looked at many blocks and has been able to reconstruct scenes of battle and the aftermath of battle in his PhD dissertation. So we see here King Tut with ships going north to do battle. Now, whether that's an actual battle or just the sense of Tutankhamun needs to pretend, even though he's 18 years old, that he's led actual wars is still debated. But there's no question that also Tutankhamun carried out monumental scenes in his temples which were battle-oriented. So back to Abydos 30 years ago. I told you I discovered at the base of the pyramid, this temple was already known from the British 1990, went back to it, found these battle scenes, and what was exciting is we started finding scenes of these foreigners located across these two temple areas, but we think they were probably based in a courtyard in this main pyramid temple. And I told you that the archers were exciting because I found that first, but also it gave us a very good indication. You see these archers, Nubian archers, darker skinned, shooting up in the air, and it gives us an idea that what's happening here is that three archers in a group, and many more besides probably, if we had all the pieces, are firing up at a citadel near a city with crenellations, these bumps that are at the top of a fortress wall or a city wall. The Egyptians in this case are bringing a siege ladder up to the wall and then besieging the city, and these yellow-skinned Canaanites are dead and dying, and they're always fleeing and so on. So Nubian mercenaries alongside the Egyptians shown red fighting the Canaanites, and this probably closely is what we'd have here, probably Nubian archers with their long bows fighting alongside Egyptian forces. And here just a broader view of that, a lot earlier scene, by the way. So this is possible to be from 1550, right? Ahmose had scenes like this because this is in a tomb from 2000 BC, 500 years almost earlier, the tomb of General Intef at Thebes, Dynasty 11, Middle Kingdom. Moving along, similar scenes from the temple of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahri, again, about 2000 BC, so 500 years earlier. Foreigners, yellow-skinned Canaanites, pierced with arrows, dead and dying, and falling down from a siege ladder. And these have never been fully analyzed or reconstructed. When we get into the developed 18th dynasty, we see wonderful tomb scenes, and the Met has in it, outside Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium, a whole bunch of these wonderful paintings done by Norman and Nina DeGarris Davies. They're watercolor and gouache replicas of tomb scenes, and I really recommend you spend time looking at them in the Met, where we see Canaanites with these foreign fringed garments, their beards, sometimes shaved heads, holding things like wine jars. This is imported Canaanite wine, and they're bringing in exotic weapons, swords, daggers, and also in these scenes, horses and chariots. Now, when I reconstruct fragments, I've been spending time, over the past years thinking more about these battle scenes and trying to draw out more of what's happening. And we can use evidence to show, to kind of, let's say, clone broader scenes from other artistic sources. So something I want to tell you is that in 1950s, also, a mortuary temple of Pharaoh Thutmose II built in the middle part of the 18th dynasty. So I'm going to guess let's say about 1400 BC. These fragments are very poorly understood. They're not relocated, but when I studied them, I could put together conceptually fragments, and you could see the back of the saddle of a horse, its harnessing, matching up with the back of another horse, and then dead and dying foreigners, some frontally facing, bits of broken chariot wheels, swords in the hands, and so on, quivers in the back of these men. And these, of course, relate to scenes that we've already seen, like the chariot body of Thutmose IV, where you see dead and dying men, some frontal, holding swords, and so on. So nothing is new here. And by the way, the axes shown are exotic Canaanite axes. When I turn to my fragments, then they make more sense as the precursors to all of this. You see the dead and dying Canaanites here that really have a close parallel in this later material. And I'm sorry for skipping wrong. Now, what really clinched in the 90s that we had the scene probably of the defeat of the Hyksos were a set of fragments. One was this. It's not very big, it's tiny really, but it gives the name Avaris, or Hutwaret, which we had on the Kamoza Stela, the place where the Hyksos were based in the eastern delta, that city I mentioned. And this may be, sadly, the only known fragment yet of a narrative text telling how Ahmose defeated the Hyksos. So could be fascinating if more of that is ever found. But what was extraordinary, and it's taken me this long to get around to showing you, are the fragments that we found and were stunned by. After we started finding battle fragments, we found fragments of what we immediately realized were the oral, if they're dated to the time of Ahmose, and no one's ever questioned that, within the context of a building where every brick is stamped with his name, these stone fragments of horses. And so you see beautifully carved and really quite sophisticated depictions of horses with bridling for attachment to chariots. No question that a team of chariot horses here in rest, they're not rushing headlong into war, and then sadly just bits of hieroglyphic inscription that can't be read. There's not enough there to know what it says, and boy do I wish we had more of it. But just by comparison with a reconstruction in the International Museum of the Horse in Louisville, Kentucky, the scholar with whom I worked on that TV show, Catherine Hansen, the late Catherine Hansen, studied harnessing and reconstructed these sets of chariot horses and on these mannequins so that we get a very nice, real-life sense of what this kind of scene looked like in reality. Kathy also, for that TV show, made the harnessing, or had Egyptian leather workers make it, and had to figure out how to adapt it for real-life use, and then actually having these horses pull chariots with people riding them. So, it's real experimental archaeology. Here, just some drawings of this fragment and a join I made to it, where you see the two horses, and then another two fragments. So it's clear that this is part of a whole extensive scene from the temple. And very excitingly, and extraordinarily, actually, this piece showing the wheel of a chariot with the back legs of horses, just one horse here, but there would have been actually two horses, four legs. This is a little bit of a mistaken interpretation by the artist, but that's okay. For our purposes, you can see the tails, the blue of the chariot body, some decoration here, and then one chariot wheel and a second chariot wheel. And what this indicates is that these are complex overlapping scenes of the rush into battle. So we not just have the resting horses, but we have horses in battle. Are they Egyptian horses? Are they Canaanite horses? Hard to say because we only have this bit. But what was quite exciting to me in analyzing this material is that in the fragments found in the 1950s, and again, no one had really looked through this material adequately, there were scenes of overlapping horses and chariots where the legs and the chariot wheels are arranged essentially identically. So Thutmose II, third, about let's say 150 years after Ahmose's reign, these artists are looking at this source material and they're copying it in this smashed temple. They're copying what was then this smashed temple. So, imagine all this was once sitting out and visible and could be studied and visited by artists and scholars, if you will. We have fragments I have not yet been able to fully do more with, but here we see 4 overlapping horses' legs, so a team of chariot horses, and the back of, maybe I said here, a Canaanite garment, but it's also possible it's the back of part of a chariot with that blue color. And that is the original color done here in a watercolor painting on site by Tamara Bauer, who has accompanied me many times. She's a New York artist living at the West Bath. I'm sure many of you know it. And Tamara is an extraordinary artist who reconstructs or does one-to-one paintings that show the color as discovered, which I think are better than the color photography. And these horse and chariot fragments, when we find them, occur in the same locations as the foreigners' fragments, and that gives me the idea that the scenes were based in this part of the temple, probably in the courtyard. Very typical place. If you walk into the Pyramid Temple, you would look on the left or the right at scenes of battles, and that's where they should be. Interesting, in the same style as the archers, the horses, the chariots, on the same scale, so small. These are centimeter scales, so these are tiny fragments. And the scenes weren't that large, they would have fit into something like this library, are scenes of cutting grain. And I've always been intrigued by the thought that it's not the harvesting of grain in some, wonderful scene of the calm harvest of wheat in the autumn. It's cutting down the food supply. And interestingly, that indicates that the Hyksos siege, if I'm correct, that grain is growing around the city, and that it's probably autumn when they're fighting. And that's interesting for many reasons, one of them being that they would not be traveling during inundation season, but rather later during the harvest season. So interesting to consider. And we also have scenes of royal ships. Now, why do I say royal ships? This is the stern of a ship. This is a cabin, if you will, in the shape of a vulture goddess. That vulture goddess is a royal emblem. She's Nekhbet. She only would occur as a divinity with her arms enfolding, much like you mentioned the image of the falcon god Horus enfolding the head of Khafre in the Old Kingdom. This too may be an emblem where maybe she's enfolding the name, protecting the name of the king, don't know. But here a reconstruction by Lindblad of a similar kind of a ship, a warship really, we'd have to say. And many fragments, this is a drawing by an artist, Lila Brock, that shows the hull of a ship, some of the planks indicated in color, and then an oar and the water in typical Egyptian way. And many, many fragments that show things like the rigging, bits of mast, sailors, oars in the water, and so on. But these can't be, again, pulled fully into any exact reconstruction, but years ago with Tamara Bauer, I created this image. So we have sailors sailing north from Luxor, from Thebes, from their place of warfare, from their base, really, in Thebes, north to Avaris, the capital, right, where we see the citadel. We see the archers firing up at the city. We see the cutting down of the food supply, the same kind of sad siege techniques still in use. We see, in this case, I put this in as a thought, maybe there was a supplicating enemy who's saying, we give up, because that's often the case in later Egyptian scenes. We have the pharaoh and his chariot defeating enemies who are shot dead, arrows in their bodies, holding swords, horses and chariots rushing headlong into war, and then returning back, perhaps, and the calm series of horses that we have the heads of, showing the return back to Thebes and maybe a Thanksgiving offering. So there's always 4 elements: going to war, the actual battle, returning from battle, and thanksgiving to the god Amun. And that's what I'm imagining for this. And when I say imagining, it's because we have about 5% of the scene It's like if you have a jigsaw puzzle and you throw out 95% of the pieces, and you have to kind of imagine the rest. Here from the show I was telling you about, Building Pharaoh's Chariot, I really recommend you watch it. It's a very fun show. This man, Rob Herford, is the guy who creates for all sorts of shows, The Gilded Age, and all of these English historical dramas, historical carriages, but also for this, created with Egyptian workmen in Cairo, a chariot that would be functional, and then these horses were trained by Kathy Hansen to, with her harnessing, to conduct on the Egyptian landscape something like an approach or a battle. And you see more of that very elaborate harnessing, which we have. You know, the artistic representations are incredible. We learn a lot, but it's not the same as actually trying to take leather and tie it into knots and figure out how it all should go together. And so it's extraordinary in this Museum of the Horse that you can see all of that, and it's a testament to Kathy's work. And just hear a sense of how all of these things come together in detailed studies. This one of King Tutankhamun, shown firing from his chariot, and very, very extensive details. And just here to show you how I take these fragments and conceptually put them into this kind of a scene. Now, I'm going to go forward and just say that actual evidence of chariots is getting to be very interesting. A recent study by Andrei Feldmeyer and Salima Ikram, who many of you know, of actual chariots, has been very helpful to me, because when we look at the details of these actual chariots found in Egyptian tombs, you see the zigzag designs, which I think are on the Ahmose fragments as well. And so it really helps to see that, yes, indeed, on this part of the back of a chariot body, you would have that particular decor. You see it again here on a fragment from the site of Amarna, excavated by the Germans and now in Berlin. And also the rich green and red colors. So the green may have changed color. It might have been originally more like this blue. But this gives us an idea of what the design elements were, and yet more of this applique material. And they're beautiful as well, you can see. Going forward, I have many more fragments of horses and chariots that are in the forthcoming publication, and some of them are hard to interpret, but these are legs of horses, maybe parts of other chariots, legs of horses, other legs of horses, and fortunately we have color to go with them as well. But something I want to finish with is that recently, a temple of Thutmose I, and this is the Khenemet Ankh, or Uniting Life temple, the fragments of which are mostly totally gone, of Pharaoh Thutmose I. And here a door probably from this temple in the Metropolitan Museum, a wooden door, well preserved. 16 block fragments were found in storage and only published 2 years ago, 2021, by the Polish scholar Jadwiga Iwaszczuk. And what she's been able to do is what I've been trying to do with the Ahmose pieces. Put fragments back together. You can see her really great drawings here. Details at the front of the horses, the saddles. See how there's the headlong rush here, multiple horses and chariots. This person maybe not a king based on what we seem to see. And then fragments going in the opposite direction, people holding axes, more fragments of this. And so what I'm trying to do by showing you this is say that not only did our 30-year-ago discovery indicate that there could be monumental temple scenes, but the more we look at the actual evidence, there are these scenes. They exist between being redated in the Met and rediscovered in a storeroom, a tomb at Thebes, where these pieces were dug up by Egyptian archaeologists and then never studied and never published. We have even this wonderful scene that Iwaszczuk reconstructs as two sort of horses up against each other in an interesting scene, probably one dying, I'm imagining, in a scene of warfare. Now, interesting, she also is comparing these fragments of Thutmose I, 2 kings after Ahmose, with mine that you see here on the left, the element of the strap that attaches the harnessing to the front of the horses here with the fragments she's found. Very parallel, very similar, and it's exciting to me because it amplifies what I've been able to find, and even details that scholars are going to be very interested in of how the individual saddles and yokes are arranged from this, most of the first temple, and also from the 1950s discoveries of most of the second temple. So we really can say, and this is my point, and this is my last slide, much more about this whole period. What we can say is that we now clearly know that probably every ruler of the new 18th dynasty from Ahmose forward had a temple featuring these battle scenes, and that's not very surprising if you think about it, but from the perspective of 30 years ago, yes, it is surprising, and nobody posited it. And as you saw from my early slides, these texts where people said they were impossible, we now know not only were they possible, they existed. And so we're filling in our gaps through fragmentary evidence, but what I'm excited by and hoping will come forward in future excavations and future discoveries, especially of texts, would be the story of how the Egyptians even got a hold of the horse and the chariot, and how this technology transformed their warfare. And that's it.
Wow. We've got some time for questions.
Just trying to make it clear. Those chariot wheels that have just the straight cross, those are earlier. And
Right.
you get later, you get more spokes.
I'm just going to go scroll back here, and you can just see on this one,
Yeah.
4-spoke chariot wheels seem to be earlier, and you know, we have that in the Ahmose ones, also in this, most of the first material.
Right. And because
Later on they get
Amun
6 and
Hotep
8
the first,
spokes. Sorry?
Amun Hotep the second, I think, also still has that.
I think then you get more.
Yeah.
By the middle 18th dynasty. There are many questions about why that is so. One thing is that the chariots make it heavier, so that they need more spokes to support the weight. But we don't know.
Well, what I was curious about is, do we know what the Hyksos chariot wheels
No.
look like?
That's the problem.
Because-
And so are we looking at Canaanite chariots or Egyptian chariots, and are they differentiated?
The one kind of chariot that I know has 4 spokes like that throughout is Mycenaean.
Yeah.
And Mycenaean paintings of processions of chariots later on, it's true, have that same blue background color that you've got in all of your paintings. And I just wonder, the one question I have, when you asked, which is a brilliant question, how did they get this? How did they get these chariots? They've now got the second intermediate period, which when I started studying even was 200 years plus. Everybody was saying even more. It was a great contraction to make it only 200 years. People used to say 500 years before that. And now it's cut down to 100 years, which makes me think that there's not that much time for training and for bringing people in. It's a very short time period.
Yeah, I didn't say enough about this, so I'm going to jump off from your question and comment to say just one little bit more, which is, you're absolutely right? We're talking about not just a physical set of machines that have to be brought in, right? At the very least, we can imagine they're importing cars, right? They're importing chariots, and then they get these animals. But no, we're talking about breeding the horses, and we're talking about training them. And we have Hittite horse training manuals that are very, very explicit. And in fact, the earliest Sanskrit-like words occur in these horse training manuals. And it's fascinating, because that means that even the Hittites and the Mitanni in Syria are getting knowledge from further afield, Iran or India. And what they're saying is, well, we have this thing we do with horses. We take them 6 times around a track, and this is called a sapta vartana. And then we have another one that's called a pancha vartana, 5 turns. Those are Indo-European words. What does it mean? It means that all these people who are learning how to do horses and chariots have manuals and knowledge that are coming from further afield, from other language groups. And they're then going to Greece, as you say, and into Egypt, and they're coming with specialists, people who are charioteers, who are singing the songs and, telling the lore, and I imagine telling the myths that go along with all this, the deities. It's this, I call it the horse and chariot package. It's a cultural package. Weapons, training knowledge, breeding. But the training Anne picked up on is vital. This does not happen overnight, right? You have to have bloodlines, and the fact that we have in let's say the Ramesses kings by 1250 BC, they named their horses, right? We know that the Egyptian pharaohs said, oh, this is my favorite horse. It's called the first horse of the pharaoh. Ramses is fantastic, And so they have names. Usually something like Ramses is great, or long live King Ramses. Those names mean that they're bloodlines. They're keeping bloodlines. The same way we do with thoroughbreds today, and I'm sure of it. And none of this evidence has been discovered, right? So this is stuff we just have to imagine. And this is where we turn to historic novels and to creative writing. But I don't know. And also, I don't think anyone has really adequately thought about Mycenae, Greece, mainland Greece, and Crete in terms of the horse at the same time as Egypt. It's the same time. It's the same exact moment.